If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. Why I quit my forest ranger job. I've always loved the solitude of the forest. That's why I became a ranger in the first place. It wasn't about the paycheck, it never is with this kind of job, but about the peace I felt being surrounded by towering pines and endless trails. But after what happened last summer, I'll never set foot in those woods again. I still have nightmares, even though I'm miles away from that place now. It started with a series of dreams so vivid they left me gasping for air when I woke up. At first, I chalked them up to stress. Being a ranger sounds peaceful, but the job has its share of pressure, especially during fire season. But these dreams? They were something else entirely. The first one was subtle. I dreamt I was standing in the middle of the forest at night, the trees pressing in like they were alive, breathing. Everything was eerily quiet, except for the sound of footsteps crunching leaves behind me. I turned around, expecting to see someone, maybe a lost hiker, but there was no one there. The footsteps didn't stop, though. They grew louder, closer, until I woke up in a cold sweat. I told myself it was nothing, just a bad dream. But the next night, it was the same thing, only this time, I could hear someone whispering my name. By the third night, the dreams had shifted. It wasn't just footsteps and whispers anymore. There was something watching me. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there, just beyond the trees. It had this strange, almost human shape, but its proportions were off, its arms too long, its movements too jerky, like it didn't quite know how to walk properly. The worst part was its voice. It sounded like my colleague, Ben. I kept hearing him call out, "Hey, you there? You okay?" But it wasn't him. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. When I woke up, I was shaking so hard I thought I was going to be sick. The next day, I decided to mention it to Ben. He laughed it off, called me paranoid, but I could tell it made him uneasy too. That's when he told me about the stories he'd heard from the locals, about something in the forest that could mimic voices, lure people off the trails. He said they used to call it a skinwalker, but no one really believed that stuff anymore. Just campfire tales, he said, trying to sound casual. But the way he avoided my eyes told me he wasn't so sure. That night, I told myself I'd keep my mind off it, maybe have a few beers to relax. Instead, I woke up around 2 a.m., drenched in sweat, because I'd heard Ben's voice again, this time outside my cabin window. I froze. My cabin was in the middle of the ranger station, with no reason for Ben, or anyone, to be out there in the dead of night. But the voice was unmistakable. "Hey, you in there? Open up." It sounded exactly like him, but something was off. The tone was too flat, too hollow, like someone playing a bad recording. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, clutching my blanket like a kid afraid of monsters. When the voice came again, it was louder, angrier. "I know you're in there. Open the damn door." I don't know what possessed me, but I finally managed to pull myself out of bed and peek through the curtains. There was no one there. The porch was empty, but the voice kept coming, now calling from somewhere deeper in the woods. It sounded like Ben was walking away, yelling for me to follow. My gut told me to stay put, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air felt wrong, heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. I followed the voice into the woods, my pulse hammering in my ears. After a few minutes, it stopped calling my name. Instead, I heard something else, the sound of someone, or something, breathing low and ragged, just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. The breathing was so close it felt like I could feel it on the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered, which made my heart nearly stop. I whispered to myself, just keep walking, but my legs felt like they were sinking into the ground. The forest was eerily still. No wind, no animals, nothing but that horrible, wet breathing. Then I heard the sound of twigs snapping behind me, slow and deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was following wanted me to know it was there. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. It was tall, lanky, with arms that dangled too far down. Its face. I don't even know if I'd call it a face. It was pale and featureless, like someone had stretched skin over a skull. But the worst part was the way it moved, jerky and unnatural, as if it didn't quite know how to control its own body. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief second, the beam landed directly on it. That's when it smiled. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with teeth that looked more like jagged bones than anything human. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body just acted on its own. I bolted back toward the cabin, branches scratching my face and arms as I tore through the woods. That thing, whatever it was, didn't run after me. Instead, I could hear it moving, its footsteps matching mine, but in that strange, jerking way, like it was almost mocking me. Every time I thought I'd gained distance, it would make this awful clicking noise, and suddenly it felt closer. I didn't dare look back again. I was too afraid of what I'd see. When I finally burst out of the tree line, the ranger station lights felt like salvation. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. That's when I noticed the radio on my desk was crackling. At first, I thought it was just static, but then I heard it again, Ben's voice. "Hey, you there? Come on, man, answer me." My hands shook as I reached for the radio, but something made me stop. The tone was wrong, just like before. Flat, emotionless. "You okay?" "I'm just outside." I didn't answer the radio. I couldn't. My gut screamed that it wasn't Ben, that whatever was out there was playing some sick game. Instead, I grabbed my phone and tried calling him directly. The line rang twice before going to voicemail. I stared at the radio, my heart pounding, as the voice came again, now more insistent. "Come on, man, open the door. It's me." I stayed frozen in my chair, trying to think. If that really was Ben, why didn't he just come inside? The ranger station wasn't locked when I first came in. He wouldn't need to call me over the radio. That's when I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. The doorknob rattled, and my breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a fire poker from the station's old wood stove, and held it tight. Then I heard it again, but this time it wasn't Ben's voice. It was mine. "Hey, you okay in there?" It was like hearing a recording of myself, every inflection, every tone, perfect. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that. Whatever this thing was, it knew me. It wasn't guessing. It was copying. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling so badly I almost fell. The thing outside didn't stop. It kept speaking in my voice, but the words were wrong, disjointed, like it was stringing together pieces of things I'd said before. "Come outside. It's safe. You're okay. Just open the door." I wanted to scream, but it felt like my throat was glued shut. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching that fire poker like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The footsteps eventually stopped, but the voice didn't. It was farther away now, coming from the tree line, repeating the same phrases over and over. And then it went silent. That might have been the worst part, the quiet. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring at the door, my back against the wall. When the sun finally came up, I mustered the courage to step outside. There were no signs of anything or anyone out there. No footprints on the porch, no damage to the door. I even tried calling Ben again, but he never picked up. Later that afternoon, the station got a call. A search team had been dispatched. Ben was officially missing. The search for Ben lasted 3 days. I joined the first 2 sweeps, even though every instinct told me to stay out of those woods. It felt like the trees were pressing in on us, the air heavy with something I can only describe as malice. No one else seemed to notice, though. The other rangers and volunteers kept calling his name, their voices echoing through the forest. But I couldn't bring myself to yell. I was too scared something would answer back. On the 3rd day, they found his radio and his hat near one of the deeper trails, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd just vanished. After that, I refused to go back into the forest. I made up excuses, told my supervisor I was handling logistics at the station, but the truth was, I couldn't even look at the tree line without feeling sick. That's when the dreams started again. Only this time, they weren't dreams. I'd wake up to hear footsteps circling the cabin or that same ragged breathing just outside the window. One night, I swear I saw something in the tree line, its pale face glowing faintly in the dark. I quit the next morning. I didn't even pack most of my stuff. I just left. It's been 6 months since I left, and I still don't have an explanation for what happened out there. I've read about skinwalkers, wendigos, mimics, whatever you want to call them, but none of it feels real until you experience it yourself. I've tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that stress and lack of sleep made me hallucinate. But then I remember the sound of my own voice outside that door, the way it mimicked Ben so perfectly, and I know it wasn't just in my head. I never heard anything more about Ben. The official report lists him as missing, presumed dead. Sometimes I wonder if he heard my voice, too, if that thing called him out into the woods the same way it tried to lure me. I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is, I'll never set foot in those woods again. And if you ever find yourself working as a forest ranger, or even hiking deep in the wilderness, remember this. If you hear someone calling your name, don't answer. Not unless you're absolutely sure it's human. The dreaded walk home. Back in 2019, I was 26, working at a mid-sized marketing firm in Dublin. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and gave me just enough energy to hit the pubs with friends on weekends. I'd moved into the city a year earlier, renting a small flat near St. Stephen's Green. Most evenings, I'd walk the 15 minutes home after work, rain or shine, headphones in, losing myself in a podcast or playlist. The route was predictable, a quiet stretch past the canal, a couple of alleyways, and then the bustling hum of Grafton Street before I reached my building. It wasn't the safest walk, but Dublin always felt familiar, like a big village where people knew your face. One night in October, I stayed late finishing a campaign proposal. By the time I left the office, the streets had emptied, and a heavy mist rolled in, blurring the streetlights. I had my headphones on, as usual, but something felt off. You know when the air around you seems too quiet? Like the world is holding its breath? I glanced back a couple of times, seeing nothing but shadows stretching under the dim lights. I told myself to stop being paranoid, chalked it up to exhaustion, and kept walking. Halfway down the canal, though, I noticed footsteps behind me. Steady, measured, and always maintaining the same distance. I slowed my pace, pretending to check my phone, hoping whoever it was would pass me. But the footsteps stopped too. My stomach tightened. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse without being too obvious. A man stood about 20 meters back, partially obscured by the fog. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, his face hidden in shadow. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just some guy walking home, same as me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I picked up my pace, almost jogging as I reached the alleyway that would cut a few minutes off my walk. It was a riskier route at night, but I wanted to get home as fast as possible. The footsteps grew faster too. I could hear them now, heavy and deliberate. My throat went dry, and adrenaline kicked in. I turned the corner into the alley, hoping I could lose him. But as I entered, I realized just how quiet it was. No cars, no people, just the faint hum of the city in the distance. And then I heard it, the scrape of a shoe against the wet pavement behind me. I didn't dare look back this time. Instead, I broke into a full sprint. My bag thumped against my hip, and my breath came in sharp gasps, each one echoing unnaturally loud in the narrow alley. The footsteps behind me quickened too, closing the gap. I reached the end of the alley and burst out onto the main road, the sound of my own panic drowned out by the sudden rush of cars and chatter of late-night pubgoers. I glanced over my shoulder, but the man was gone. Just like that. I tried to convince myself I'd overreacted. Maybe he wasn't following me at all, just taking the same route. Still, I couldn't shake the lingering unease as I reached my flat. I double-checked the locks and peered out the window for what felt like ages. The street was empty, eerily still, with only the occasional clatter of a bottle or a passing car. I told myself I was being ridiculous and forced myself to go to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind outside made my heart race. The next day at work, I tried to laugh it off. City life, I told myself, but the truth was, I felt on edge all morning. I caught myself checking the office windows, half expecting to see that man standing across the street. By lunch, I'd almost managed to forget about it until I got back to my desk and noticed a small envelope sitting on my keyboard. It wasn't unusual for clients to drop off handwritten notes or thank you cards, but this wasn't that. It had no name, no company logo, just my first name scrawled in black ink. I opened it cautiously, and my stomach dropped. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words. "Nice run yesterday." My hands shook as I reread it, trying to process what it meant. No one at work would know about my sprint through the alley, and I hadn't told anyone. I felt exposed, like someone had peeled away the thin layer of safety I'd convinced myself I had. I looked around the office, scanning every face for something, anything, that seemed out of place. But everyone was just normal. Laughing, working, going about their day. I took the note to my manager, Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd been with the company for years. Her brow furrowed as she read it, and she immediately asked if I wanted to report it to HR or even the Gardai. I hesitated. What would I say? That someone followed me home and left a cryptic note on my desk? It felt too flimsy, like I'd sound paranoid. Sarah must have sensed my reluctance because she suggested we keep it quiet for now, but she'd keep an eye out and notify security to review the building's cameras. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. My usual tasks blurred together, and I jumped every time someone walked past my desk. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, I was exhausted but dreading the walk home. I decided to call a cab instead. As I stood outside waiting, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. Across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a doorway, was the same man. He was still wearing the dark jacket and cap, his posture unervingly casual, as though he had all the time in the world. Our eyes met, and he didn't look away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, almost like he was daring me to react. My breath caught in my throat as I froze on the spot, unsure what to do. Should I run back inside? Confront him? Call the Gardai? My cab pulled up just then, its headlights slicing through the growing darkness. Without thinking, I darted toward the car, nearly yanking the door off its hinges in my rush to get inside. The driver, an older man with a thick brogue, gave me a startled look but didn't ask questions. As we pulled away, I glanced back through the rear window. The man hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching, his figure dissolving into the shadows as we turned the corner. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside my window made me jump, and the oppressive weight of his stare lingered in my mind. By the next morning, I was running on fumes. As soon as I got to the office, Sarah called me into her office. The security team had reviewed the footage from the previous day. "We caught him," she said, sliding her laptop toward me. There he was, clear as day, loitering by the entrance just before lunch, watching the door. But what made my stomach churn was the timestamp. He'd been there hours before I arrived, waiting for me. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. "Do you recognize him?" Sarah asked, her voice low and serious. I shook my head. He didn't look familiar, but there was something in his posture, calculated, deliberate, that sent a chill down my spine. Sarah told me she was escalating this to HR and the Gardai immediately. The security team had already flagged the footage, and the company's IT department was instructed to monitor any unusual activity involving employee files or emails. That afternoon, I received a strange email from an untraceable address. The subject line read, "Do you miss it?" The body of the email was even more unsettling. "You took something from me. Now it's my turn." I felt sick. My palms were sweating as I forwarded it to Sarah and the IT team. Within minutes, she came over with a grim expression. "I think I know who this is," she said. "His name is Alan Doyle. He used to work here. He was fired last year for threatening another employee." My heart sank. The pieces began to click together. He wasn't just following me. He'd been inside the building, maybe even sitting at my desk. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Alan Doyle. I vaguely remembered hearing whispers about him when I first joined the company. A quiet, intense guy who'd snapped after being passed over for a promotion. Security had escorted him out, and no one ever mentioned him again. But now, he wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was here, watching me, invading my life. Sarah assured me that building security was being tightened and that Gardai were taking the situation seriously, but it didn't feel like enough. My flat felt like a flimsy shield against someone so determined. That evening, I wasn't taking any chances. I stayed at a friend's place across the city, but even there, I couldn't relax. My phone buzzed around midnight, and when I checked, it was a text from an unknown number. "Running won't help." My blood ran cold. I didn't know how he'd gotten my number, and I didn't care. All I knew was that this wasn't going to stop on its own. My friend, alarmed by my reaction, insisted we call the Gardai right then. When we did, they finally seemed to grasp the severity of the situation. They sent someone over to take a statement, and I showed them the texts, the email, and even described the man from the footage. The Gardai officer, a young man named O'Connell, took my account seriously. He promised to escalate the case and advised me to stay somewhere secure for a few days. Still, his reassurances didn't quiet the nagging fear that Alan was always one step ahead. The next morning, Sarah called to update me. The IT team had discovered something chilling. Alan had breached the company's network. He'd been accessing employee profiles, including mine, weeks before I'd even noticed anything unusual. They found drafts of unsent emails addressed to me, all increasingly threatening. Worse, Alan had somehow obtained my home address from an old HR record. I felt exposed, like every layer of my life had been stripped away. "We're working with the Gardai to track him," Sarah said, her voice steady but tense. "In the meantime, don't go home alone, and don't come into the office. We'll handle this." It was sound advice, but it didn't feel like enough. I couldn't sit around waiting for him to make his next move. That evening, as I stayed holed up in my friend's flat, I decided to check the apartment's security camera feeds, a feature I'd barely ever used. My hands shook as I clicked through the footage, half expecting to see nothing. But there he was, Alan, standing outside my flat 2 nights ago, staring directly into the camera. He didn't even try to hide his face. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. Alan wasn't just lurking, he was taunting me. His expression was eerily calm, his head tilted slightly as if he were studying the lens, daring me to do something about it. I saved the clip and forwarded it to the Gardaí immediately. O'Connell called me shortly after, his tone clipped and serious. "This changes things," he said. "We're putting out a formal alert. We'll station someone near your flat in case he shows up again." It felt like progress, but it didn't erase the gnawing fear in my chest. That night, I barely slept. Every noise in the flat seemed amplified, every shadow stretched into something sinister. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number. "I see you." My blood ran cold. I raced to the window, but the street below was empty. My friend woke up, alarmed by my pacing. "This is insane," she said, grabbing her phone. "We're calling the Gardaí again. He can't keep getting away with this." The Gardaí arrived within 20 minutes, scanning the area and taking another statement. They promised to trace the number, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew Alan wouldn't make it that easy. The next morning, I woke to an email from Sarah. The Gardaí and IT team had traced Alan's recent activity to a rented flat not far from the office. They were working with his landlord to get access, but it would take time. In the meantime, Sarah told me the company was covering my stay at a secure hotel, insisting it was safer than bouncing between friends' places. I agreed reluctantly. The hotel was modern and comfortable, but I felt trapped, like a sitting duck waiting for Alan to make his next move. That evening, as I settled into the hotel room, there was a knock at the door. My stomach clenched. I hadn't ordered anything, and the Gardaí hadn't mentioned sending anyone over. Slowly, I approached the peephole. It was a hotel staff member, a woman holding a tray with a covered dish. "Room service," she said, smiling. I hadn't ordered room service. My gut screamed at me to stay put. "I didn't order this," I called through the door, my voice shaking. Her smile faltered. Mr. Doyle sent it for you," she said. My blood turned to ice. I stepped back from the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm sorry, there's been a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know anyone named Doyle." The woman hesitated for a moment, looking genuinely confused. "He called the front desk earlier. Said it was a surprise for his friend staying in this room." My stomach dropped. Alan had found me. Somehow, he knew exactly where I was. "I don't want it. Please take it back," I managed to choke out. She nodded and walked away, but my legs were already trembling as I locked the door's deadbolt and slid the security chain across. I called the Gardaí immediately, barely able to form words. They arrived within the hour, combing through the hotel's security footage. Sure enough, there he was. Alan had been at the front desk earlier that evening, wearing a nondescript hoodie and using what the Gardaí later determined to be a fake ID. He'd checked into a room 2 floors below mine. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. He wasn't just watching from a distance anymore. He was here, in the same building, just steps away. The Gardaí moved quickly, coordinating with hotel security to quietly evacuate me to another location. This time, there was no waiting around for the next move. They stormed his room. When the Gardaí entered Alan's room, I waited in a secure office in the hotel's back area, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, O'Connell returned, his face unreadable. "He's gone," he said, and my heart sank. The room was empty, meticulously clean, almost like he'd never been there. But he'd left something behind, a single envelope, propped up on the desk. It had my name on it, written in the same jagged handwriting as the note I'd found on my desk at work. O'Connell handed me a copy of the letter after the forensics team had scanned it for evidence. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. The message was chillingly simple. You'll never be safe. That was it. No demands, no explanation, just a promise that he wasn't done. The Gardai assured me they were doing everything possible to track him down. His fake ID had been traced to a local print shop, and they were confident they'd find a lead soon. But their reassurances felt hollow. Alan had slipped through their fingers again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step ahead. The Gardai insisted on moving me to a safe house while they worked to track Alan. It was a small, nondescript bungalow on the outskirts of Dublin, with reinforced locks and constant patrols in the area. I was grateful for the protection, but the isolation gnawed at me. The quiet nights felt oppressive, every creak in the house setting my nerves on edge. I kept all the lights on and rarely ventured outside, terrified that Alan would somehow find a way to reach me. A week passed without incident, and I began to hope that maybe the Gardai were right. Maybe Alan was on the run now, and his threats were empty. But just as I started to let my guard down, the phone rang late one night. It wasn't my personal mobile, but the landline in the safe house, a number only the Gardai had. My breath caught as I answered, expecting one of the officers. Instead, a familiar voice crackled through the line. "You think they can protect you?" Alan's voice was calm, almost conversational, but it made my blood run cold. "I've always been closer than you think." I slammed the phone down and immediately called O'Connell. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived to sweep the house. They found no sign of a break-in, no indication that Alan had been there. But the call confirmed one thing. He'd gotten through the Gardai's defenses yet again. He wasn't just stalking me, he was proving a point. The call was the final straw. O'Connell and his team decided to escalate things further. They installed additional surveillance around the safe house, including hidden cameras and motion detectors. They also arranged for an officer to stay on site with me around the clock. Despite these measures, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alan was always one step ahead. His ability to find me, no matter where I went, felt almost supernatural. It wasn't just stalking, it was psychological warfare. 2 nights later, the motion sensors triggered at 3:47 a.m. The officer stationed in the house, a woman named Detective Byrne, reacted immediately. I stayed locked in my bedroom as she and 2 other officers swept the property. This time, they found something. Taped to the back door was another note, written in the same jagged handwriting. "You can't hide forever." My legs gave out when Byrne showed it to me. He'd been right outside, mere meters away, while we were inside. But Alan had finally slipped up. The Gardai retrieved a partial fingerprint from the tape and matched it to his records. Combined with a recent sighting near a bus station, they finally pinpointed his likely location, a decrepit house he'd rented on the outskirts of town. This time, they weren't taking any chances. A full team was sent to raid the property, and I was placed under even tighter protection. The hours dragged by as I waited for news. Every time the phone buzzed, my heart leapt into my throat, half expecting it to be Alan taunting me again. Finally, just before dawn, O'Connell called. "We've got him," he said, and the relief was so overwhelming that I collapsed into the nearest chair. Alan had been found holed up in the crumbling house, surrounded by surveillance equipment, notebooks filled with chilling details about me, and even a stash of photos he'd taken. Some from outside my flat, others from my office, and one, taken through my window, of me asleep in my own bed. O'Connell's voice was calm but firm as he explained what they'd found. He had everything planned. He'd been watching you for months, learning your routines. The notes, the emails, it was all part of his game. They arrested Alan without incident, though the guardie warned me it would take time for the legal process to unfold. I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The immediate threat was over. The aftermath wasn't easy. I couldn't go back to my flat. Knowing Alan had been inside my life for so long made it unbearable. The company arranged for me to work remotely for a while, and I eventually moved to a new city entirely, hoping for a fresh start. I still double-check every lock, avoid walking alone, and sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, expecting to see him standing in the shadows. But I remind myself that he's behind bars now. Even though I'm safe, a part of me will never forget the way he made me feel, like prey. And sometimes, I wonder if he's sitting in his cell, still thinking about the next move in his twisted game. Uneasy Street. I never thought I'd be one of those people sharing a creepy story online, but honestly, I can't keep this to myself anymore. This happened about 3 weeks ago, and even now, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was walking back to my flat in London after a study session at the library. I usually stick to well-lit streets, but that night, I was tired and figured cutting through a quieter side street would shave 10 minutes off my walk. It wasn't completely deserted. There were a few houses and a couple of dim streetlights, but it definitely had an uneasy vibe. I remember noticing how quiet it was. No cars, no footsteps, nothing. Just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. About halfway down the street, I heard it. A sound I can only describe as a mix between a low growl and someone struggling to breathe. It wasn't loud, but it stopped me dead in my tracks. My first thought was that it might be an injured animal, like a fox or something, but the sound was wrong. It felt too deliberate, almost like it was meant to get my attention. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I told myself to keep walking, that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I forced myself to keep walking, trying to act normal, but my body was screaming at me to turn around and run. The sound came again, closer this time, and I swear I felt it in my chest, like a vibration. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a person, tall, pale, and thin, but something was off. Its proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, like it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. It stood under one of the faint streetlights, just far enough away that I couldn't make out its face, but I could tell it was looking at me. I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing, like it was rejecting it as impossible. It didn't move for what felt like an eternity, just stood there, swaying slightly, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then it made that noise again, this time louder, almost like a gurgling laugh. That was it. My fight or flight kicked in, and I bolted down the street. I could hear my own breathing, my footsteps echoing, but worst of all, I could hear it following me. It wasn't running, it didn't need to. The sound of its uneven, shuffling steps was enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't dare look back again. My only thought was to get to the main road where there would be people, lights, cars, anything to make me feel safe. But the street seemed to stretch forever, like I wasn't getting any closer to the end. The thing behind me wasn't gaining on me, but it wasn't falling behind either. Its footsteps were steady, deliberate, and the sound of that guttural, wheezing noise kept cutting through the air. I remember thinking, how is no one else hearing this? There were houses on that street, but every window was dark, every door shut tight. It was like I'd stepped into some pocket of reality where I was completely alone. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop running. I didn't feel safe until I was standing outside my building, fumbling with my keys to get inside. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it standing there, just at the edge of the shadows. But it wasn't. The street was empty. No strange sounds, no pale figure, nothing. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I was just overtired and my mind had played tricks on me. But when I got into my flat and locked the door behind me, I realized I couldn't stop shaking. My legs felt like jelly, and my heart was still pounding like I'd just run a marathon. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Its pale, twisted shape standing under that streetlight, the unnatural way it moved, and that horrible, guttural noise. I kept replaying the sound of its footsteps, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, or maybe some weird prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever I saw wasn't normal. It didn't belong. I ended up sitting on my bed with all the lights on, clutching my phone, just waiting for the sun to come up. The next day, I tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. I even considered going back to that street during daylight, just to prove to myself there was nothing there. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every time I thought about walking down that road again, my chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. A week later, I took a different route home, even though it added almost 20 minutes to my walk. I don't know what scares me more, the thought of seeing it again, or the possibility that it's still out there, waiting. Since that night, I've avoided that street entirely. Even during the day, I can't bring myself to go near it. The fear hasn't gone away, it's always in the back of my mind, like a weight pressing down on me. I've started paying more attention to my surroundings, especially when I'm walking alone at night. Every shadow feels like it's hiding something, every strange noise makes my stomach drop. It's not just paranoia, it feels like whatever I saw that night is still with me somehow, like it marked me. I've even started having nightmares about it. In the dreams, it's always closer, its face just out of focus, its horrible noise echoing in my ears. The worst part? I don't know what it wanted. It didn't attack me, didn't chase me outright, but it was there, watching, following. And that's what haunts me the most, that I'll never know. Maybe it was just curious, or maybe it was something worse. Either way, I haven't told anyone about this in real life. Who would believe me? They'd say I imagined it, or it was just some creepy guy messing around. But I know what I saw wasn't human. And every time I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that one day, it'll find me again. Waffle House freezer incident. I've been working as a manager at a Waffle House just off I-95 for about 5 years now. This was back in 2018, during my regular night shift, those long quiet hours between 10 p.m. and sunrise when you mostly serve truckers, road trippers, and the occasional insomniac looking for greasy comfort food. Our place was small, just like most Waffle Houses, with that familiar yellow glow and the constant hum of the griddle. Back then, we had a crew of 4, including me, Karen, the fiery redhead waitress who'd been there longer than anyone, Tony, our line cook who could flip pancakes with one hand while texting with the other, and Jazz, our youngest, a dishwasher fresh out of high school, always with his headphones in. It was a routine place, predictable, until the freezer started acting up. The walk-in freezer sat at the far end of the kitchen, a looming steel box that always seemed colder than it needed to be, even for a freezer. At first, it was just little things. Tony swore he'd left a carton of eggs on the counter, only to find it back in the freezer. Karen complained about hearing the door creak open when no one was near it. It's just the hinges, I told her, but the thing was brand new. Then there was the time Jazz came out pale as a sheet, saying he heard someone whisper his name when he went to grab more waffle batter. I rolled my eyes and teased him about listening to creepy podcasts too much. But honestly, there was a weird vibe around that freezer, like you could almost feel it watching you. Things got weirder after that. One night, I was doing inventory around 2 a.m., clipboard in hand, standing right outside the freezer. The kitchen was quiet except for the steady hum of the fridge units, but then I heard something, a soft knock, coming from inside. My first thought was Jazz playing a prank. "Very funny," I called out, pulling the freezer door open. It was empty, just shelves of boxed patties and frozen hash browns. I felt this strange, icy draft, colder than usual, and for a second, I swear the air felt heavier, like the freezer was holding its breath. I shook it off and slammed the door shut. When I turned around, Karen was standing behind me with a tray of coffee mugs, staring at the freezer like she'd just seen a ghost. The next day, she cornered me during the pre-shift prep. "You know about the guy, right?" she said, lighting a cigarette even though we were standing right under the no smoking sign. "What guy?" I asked. She told me about a cook who worked there back in the 80s, a kid named Sam. According to Karen, he'd gotten locked in the freezer by accident during a busy shift. No one noticed he was missing until the end of the night. When they finally opened the door, it was too late. The story sounded like one of those urban legends people tell to scare the newbies, but something about the way Karen looked, like she was daring me to laugh, made my stomach turn. After Karen's story, I couldn't stop thinking about the freezer. The idea of someone dying like that, alone, in the dark, surrounded by frost, made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off as just another workplace rumor, but things escalated fast. A few nights later, Tony came flying out of the kitchen, pale and shaking. "I'm not going back in there," he muttered, pointing toward the freezer. I calmed him down enough to get the story out. He said he'd been grabbing bacon when the door slammed shut behind him. He swore he saw handprints on the frosted glass window, moving like someone was trying to claw their way out. "It's the condensation," I told him, but deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. I decided to check it out myself after the shift ended. It was around 3 a.m. when I stepped into the freezer, armed with nothing but my phone's flashlight. The air was thick and biting cold, and every breath I took fogged up instantly. I scanned the shelves, looking for anything out of place, but it was all just food and boxes. As I turned to leave, I felt it. Something brushed past my arm, light but unmistakable, like the hem of a shirt. I whipped around, heart pounding, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the far corner. My flashlight flickered, and I stumbled out of there, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that day, and when I came back to work, I told the staff to avoid the freezer unless absolutely necessary. The crew didn't argue about avoiding the freezer. In fact, they seemed relieved. For the next week, we managed by stocking as much as we could outside the walk-in. But that didn't stop the strange occurrences. The sound of the freezer door opening and closing by itself became a regular thing, always when no one was near it. Karen said she saw a figure standing by the door out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, it was gone. Jazz flat out refused to go near the kitchen when the freezer was in view. "I'm not getting locked in there," he said, and the fear in his voice wasn't something you could fake. I started digging into the restaurant's history, hoping to prove Karen wrong about the story of Sam. It wasn't easy, but after some online searching and a call to the regional manager, I found out the truth. A young cook had died in the freezer back in 1985. The old manager claimed it was a freak accident, but there were whispers that Sam had been overworked, running the line alone on a packed shift. The idea that someone's life ended like that, because no one noticed or cared enough to check, hit me hard. I couldn't stop picturing him trapped, pounding on the door as the cold seeped in. I couldn't shake the guilt, even though I hadn't been there when it happened. The thought of Sam's story being forgotten, buried under years of bacon grease and coffee stains, felt wrong. That night, after the shift ended, I stayed late and did something I never thought I'd do. I made a small memorial for him. I printed his name, Samuel Sam Redding, and taped it to the freezer door, along with a note that read, "You're remembered." I left a single lit candle in front of it, which probably violated every fire code imaginable, but it felt right. For the first time in weeks, the kitchen felt still, like the place had taken a deep breath and let it out. The next few nights were eerily quiet. No more slamming doors, no shadows, no whispers. Jazz noticed it first. "It doesn't feel creepy anymore," he said while grabbing a carton of milk from the fridge. Karen, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off, but even she admitted it felt like the air was lighter. By the end of the week, we were back to using the freezer like normal. The strange part? One of the regional managers stopped by for a surprise inspection and asked about the name on the freezer door. When I explained, she went pale. "I worked here when Sam died," she said softly. "No one ever talked about him after that." She didn't make me take the sign down. Life at the Waffle House returned to normal after that. The freezer was just a freezer again, a cold, cramped space filled with stacks of frozen waffles and bacon. The staff seemed more relaxed, and even Jazz stopped avoiding it. But I couldn't help wondering if Sam had really moved on, or if he was still there, just quieter now that someone had acknowledged him. I left the small memorial up, and it became part of the kitchen's backdrop. Sometimes, customers or delivery drivers would ask about it, and I'd tell them Sam's story. One night, months later, I was locking up when I glanced toward the freezer. The candle I'd left had burned out long ago, but the little note with Sam's name was still there. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, like a sigh carried on the hum of the appliances. It wasn't scary this time, though. It felt almost peaceful. I smiled, locked the door, and stepped into the cool night air. Whatever had happened in that kitchen, I knew one thing for sure. Sam wasn't forgotten anymore. HVAC and things that go bump. I've been an HVAC technician for over a decade, and while I've had my share of strange experiences, nothing could have prepared me for what happened last month. I got a call from a family living in a remote farmhouse about an hour outside the city. They said their heater had been making weird noises, like banging and scratching, and it had been getting worse over the past week. Normally, I'd chalk something like that up to an animal getting into the ductwork or maybe a mechanical issue, but when they added that the noises seemed to mimic voices, I'll admit it gave me pause. Still, a job's a job, and I didn't think much of it as I loaded up my tools and headed out. The farmhouse was exactly what you'd picture. Isolated, surrounded by fields, and a little worse for wear. The family seemed nice enough, but they were clearly on edge. The husband kept glancing at the crawlspace door like it might open on its own, and the wife kept wringing her hands as she told me how she'd heard someone whispering her name from the vents. "You'll see what I mean," she said, looking at me with wide eyes. "Just be careful down there." I brushed it off with a smile, assuring them it was probably raccoons or something. But as I crouched down and opened the crawlspace hatch, I felt this odd prickle at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. The crawlspace was cramped and damp, with just enough room for me to move on my hands and knees. The air was thick with that earthy smell of dirt and mildew, and my flashlight beam flickered across tangled wires, old insulation, and the occasional spider scuttling out of sight. As I crawled further in, the banging noise they described started up again, faint but distinct, echoing through the ductwork. It sounded rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone tapping out a pattern. I stopped to listen, trying to pinpoint the source, when I heard something else, a faint, raspy voice that made my blood run cold. It was faint but unmistakable. It said, "Hello?" in the exact tone the wife had spoken earlier. I froze. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just a trick of the air moving through the ducts. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Hello." It was uncanny, like a recording, but it came from deeper inside the crawlspace. My first instinct was to call out, but something told me not to. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon, before I forced myself to move forward. The banging had stopped, but the voice was still there, repeating hello, in intervals, each time sounding closer. My heart was pounding as I crawled toward the farthest corner where the furnace was housed, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I scanned the space. When I finally reached the furnace, everything looked normal at first. The unit was old, sure, but functional. Nothing that would explain the noises or that voice. I started checking the ducts, trying to stay focused, but that creeping sensation of being watched wouldn't let up. Then, as I shifted to inspect a loose panel, the flashlight caught something that didn't belong. About 10 feet away, tucked into the shadows, was what I can only describe as a figure. At first, I thought it was a pile of insulation or some kind of debris, but then it moved. Slowly. Deliberately. It was pale, almost white, with a gaunt, humanoid shape. Its limbs were long and thin, its body unnervingly still except for its head, which tilted slightly as if it were studying me. I was paralyzed, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when it opened its mouth. What came out wasn't a scream or growl like you'd expect. It was the wife's voice again, pitch perfect. "Be careful down there," it said, mimicking her exact tone from earlier. My stomach dropped, and every instinct screamed at me to get out, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing's mouth stretched wider, and it let out this garbled sound, like a recording being rewound too fast, before going silent. I don't remember deciding to move. I just found myself scrambling backward, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My flashlight shook as I kept it trained on the thing, but it didn't move. It just stayed there, crouched in the shadows, watching me. The only sound was my breathing, loud and ragged, echoing off the crawl space walls. Then, just as I thought I'd made it far enough to turn and run, it spoke again. This time, it wasn't the wife's voice. It was mine. "Hello," it said, the exact way I'd called out earlier, complete with the same nervous tremor. Hearing my own voice come from that thing was like ice water pouring down my back. I turned and crawled as fast as I could, banging my knees and elbows against the wooden beams as I went. Behind me, I heard something scrape against the dirt, slow and deliberate, like it was following me but not in any hurry. I didn't dare look back. By the time I burst out of the hatch into the daylight, I was gasping for air, covered in dirt, and shaking like a leaf. The husband and wife rushed over, asking what I'd found, but I couldn't get the words out. "There's something down there," I finally managed, and the look on their faces told me they already knew. They didn't ask any more questions, just locked the hatch behind me like they'd done it 100 times before. I packed up my tools as fast as I could, my hands trembling so badly I dropped my wrench twice. The husband stood on the porch, staring out toward the fields like he didn't want to look me in the eye. The wife stayed inside, peeking out from behind the curtains. I could feel their fear like a weight pressing down on me. Before I got in my van, I asked, "What is that thing? Have you called anyone about it?" The husband just shook his head, muttering something about it not being worth the trouble. "It doesn't leave the crawl space," he said finally, as if that was supposed to make me feel better. It didn't. The drive back to town was a blur. My mind kept replaying the moment when the thing mimicked my voice, the unnatural way it crouched in the shadows. I've been trying to rationalize it ever since. Maybe it was some kind of animal I've never seen before, or my imagination playing tricks on me in the dim light, but deep down, I know that's not true. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal either. I haven't gone back to that farmhouse, and I hope I never have to. But sometimes, when I'm working late in a quiet house, I'll catch myself listening for that voice. And every so often, in the hum of a furnace or the creak of an old vent, I think I hear it. "Hello?"